2 years before the Mast by Richard Dana Jr. Chapter 1. First Impressions. The 14th of August was the day fixed upon for the sailing of the brig Pilgrim on her voyage from Boston round Cape Horn to the western coast of North America. As she was to get under way early in the afternoon, I made my appearance on board at 12 o'clock, in full sea rig, with my chest containing an outfit for a 2 or 3 years voyage, which I had undertaken from the determination to cure a weakness of the eyes, which had obliged me to give up my studies. The change from the tight frock coat, silk cap, and kid gloves of an undergraduate at Harvard to the loose duck trousers, check shirt, and tarpaulin hat of a sailor was soon made, and I suppose that I should pass very well for a jack-tar. But it is impossible to deceive the practised eye in these matters. A sailor has a peculiar cut to his clothes, and a way of wearing them which a green hand can never get. The trousers, tight round the hips and hanging loose round the feet, a superabundance of check shirt, a lower crowned, well-varnished black hat worn on the back of the head, with a half fathom of a black ribbon hanging over the left eye, and a slip tie to the black silk neckerchief, are signs the want of which betrays the beginner at once. Besides the point in my dress which were out of the way, doubtless my complexion and hands were quite enough to distinguish me from the regular salt, who, with a sunburnt cheek, wide step, and rolling gait, swings his bronzed and toughened hands half opened, as though just ready to grasp a rope. We hauled out into the stream and came to anchor for the night. The next day we were employed in preparation for sea, reeving, studying sail gear, crossing royal yards, putting on chafing gear, and taking on board our powder. On the following night I stood my first watch. I remained awake nearly all the first part of the night from fear that I might not hear when I was called, and when I went on deck, so great were my ideas of importance of my trust that I walked regularly fore and aft the whole length of the vessel, looking out over the bows and taffrail at each turn, and was not a little surprised at the coolness of the old seaman whom I called to take my place, in stowing himself snugly away under the long boat for a nap. That was a sufficient lookout, he thought, for a fine night at anchor in the safe harbor. The next morning was Saturday, and a breeze having sprung up from the southward, we began beating down the bay. As we drew down into the lower harbor, we found the wind ahead of and were obliged to come to anchor in the roads. We remained there through the day and part of the night. My watch began at 11 o'clock at night, and I received orders to call the captain if the wind came out from the westward. About midnight the wind became fair, and having summoned the captain, I was ordered to call all hands. How I accomplished this, I don't know, but I am quite sure that I did not give up a true hoarse boatswain call of "All hands, up anchor, ahoy!" In a short time everyone was in motion, the sails loosed, the yards braced, and we began to heave up the anchor, which was our last hold upon Yankee land. I could take but small part in these preparations. There is not so hopeless a pitiable an object in the world as a landsman beginning a sailor's life. At length those peculiar long-drawn sounds of the crew heaving at the windlass began, and in a few minutes we were under way. The noise of the water thrown from the bows was heard. The vessel leaned over from the damp night breeze and rolled with heavy groundswell, and we had actually begun our long journey. This was literally bidding good night to my native land. The first day we passed at sea was Sunday. As there was a great deal to be done on board, we were kept at work all day, and at night the watches were set and everything was put into sea order. We were called aft to be divided into watches. I had a good specimen of manner of a sea captain. After the division had been made, he gave a short characteristic speech, walking the quarterdeck with a cigar in his mouth and dropping the words out between the puffs. "Now, men, we have begun a long voyage. If we get along well together, we shall have a comfortable time. If we don't, we shall have a hell of a float. All you have to do is to obey your orders and do your duty like men. If we pull together, you'll find me a clever fellow. If you don't, you'll find me a bloody rascal. That's all I've got to say. Go below the larboard watch." I, being the starboard or second mate's watch, had the opportunity of keeping the first watch at sea. Stimson, a young man making his first voyage, was in the same watch, and as he was the son of a professional man and had been in a merchant's counting room in Boston, we found that we had some acquaintances and topics in common. We talked until he went to take his turn at the lookout, and left me to myself. I felt for the first time the perfect silence of the sea. The officer was walking the quarterdeck, where I had no right to go. One or two men were talking on the forecastle, whom I had little inclination to join, so that I was left alone to the full impression of everything about me. However much I was affected by the beauty of the sea, the bright stars, and the clouds driven swiftly over them, I could not but remember that I was separating myself from all the social and intellectual enjoyment of life. But all my dreams were soon put to flight by an order from the officer to trim the yards, as the wind was getting ahead, and I could plainly see by the looks the sailors occasionally cast to windward, and by the dark clouds that were fast coming up, that we had bad weather to prepare for. In a few minutes 8 bells were struck. The watch called, and we went below. I now began to feel the first discomforts of a sailor's life. The steerage in which I lived was filled with coils of rigging, spare sails, old junk, and ship stores, which had not been stowed away. Moreover, there had been no berths put on for us to sleep in, and we were not allowed to drive nails to hang our clothes upon. The sea, too, had risen. The vessel was rolling heavily, and everything was pitched about in grand confusion. A large hawser had been coiled away on my chest. My hats, boots, mattress, and blankets were jammed under the boxes of coils of rigging. To crown all, we were allowed no light to find anything with, and I was just beginning to feel strong symptoms of seasickness. Giving up all attempts to collect my things, I lay down on the sails, expecting every moment to hear the cry, "All hands ahoy!" which the approaching storm would make necessary. I shortly heard the raindrops falling on the deck thick and fast, and the watch evidently had their hands full of work, for I could hear the loud and repeated orders of the mate, trampling of the feet and creaking of the blocks. In a few minutes the slide of the hatch was thrown back, the cry of "All hands ahoy! Tumble up here and take in sail!" saluted our ears, and the hatch was quickly shut again. When I got upon deck, a new scene a new experience was before me. The little brig was close hauled upon the wind, and lying over, as it then seemed to me, nearly upon her beam ends. The heavy sea was beating against her bows, and with the noise and force almost of a sledge-hammer, and flying over the deck, drenching us completely through. The topsail halyards had been let go, and the great sails were filling out and backing against the mast with a noise like thunder. The wind was whistling through the rigging, loose ropes flying about, and the sailors singing out at the ropes in their hoarse and peculiar strains. In addition to this, I had not got my sea legs. We and I was dreadfully seasick, with hardly strength enough to hold on to anything. It was pitch dark. This was my condition. This was my condition when I was ordered aloft for the first time to reef topsails. How I got along, I cannot now remember. I laid out on the yards and held on with all my strength. I could not have been much of service, for I remember having been sick several times before I left the topsail yard, making wild vomits into the black night. Ew. Soon all was snug aloft, and we were again allowed to go below. This I did not consider much of a favor, for the confusion of everything below and that inexpressibly sickening smell caused by the shaking up of the bilge water in the hold made the steerage but an indifferent refuge from the cold, wet decks. This state of things continued for 2 days. Wednesday, August 20th. We had the watch on deck from 4 till 8 this morning. The sea and wind had gone down, and the stars were out bright. I stood in the waist on the weather side, watching the gradual breaking of the day. There is something in the first gray streaks stretching along the eastern horizon, and throwing an indistinct light upon the face of the deep, which combines with the boundlessness and the unknown depths of the sea around, and gives one a feeling of loneliness, of dread, and of melancholy forbidding, which nothing else in nature can. This gradually passes away as the light grows brighter, and when the sun comes up, the ordinary monotonous sea day begins. From such reflections as these, I was aroused by the order from the officer, "Forward there! Rig the head pump!" I found that no time was allowed for daydreaming, but that we must turn to at first light. Having called up the idlers, namely carpenter, cook, and steward, and rig up the pump, we began washing down the decks. This operation is performed every morning at sea, takes nearly 2 hours. I had hardly strength enough to get through it. After we had finished, swabbed down decks, and coiled up the rigging, I sat on the spars, waiting for the 7 bells, which was the signal for breakfast. The officer, seeing my lazy posture, ordered me to slush the mainmast from the royal masthead down. The vessel was then rolling a little, and I had taken no food for 3 days, so that I felt tempted to tell him that I had rather wait till after breakfast. But I knew that if I showed any sign of want of spirit or backwardness, I should be ruined at once. So I took my bucket of grease and climbed up the royal masthead. Here, the rocking of the vessel, which increases the higher you go from the foot of the mast, and the smell of the grease, upset my stomach again, and I was not a little rejoiced when I had finished my job and got upon the comparative terra firma of the deck. In a few minutes, 7 bells were struck, and the log hove. The watch called, and we went to breakfast. Here I remember the advice of the cook. "Now," says he, "my lad, you are well cleaned out. You haven't got a drop of your longshore wash aboard you. Turn to upon good hearty salt beef and ship bread, and I'll promise you'll have your ribs well seethed and your hearty as any of 'em before you're off to the Horn." I cannot describe the change which half a pound of cold salt beef and a biscuit or 2 produced in me. I was a new being. Having the watch below until noon, so that I had some time to myself, I got a huge piece of strong cold salt beef from the cook and kept gnawing upon it until 12 o'clock. When we went on deck, I felt somewhat like a man, and could begin to learn my sea duty with considerable spirit. At about 2 o'clock, we heard a loud cry of "Sail ho!" from aloft, and soon saw 2 sails to windward, going directly athwart our hawse. This was the first time that I had seen a sail at sea. I thought then, and have always since thought, that no sight exceeds it in interest, and very few in beauty. They passed to leeward of us, and out of hailing distance. Thursday, August 21st. This day the sun rose clear. We had a fine wind, and everything was bright and cheerful. I had now got my sea legs, and was beginning to enter upon the regular duties of a sea life. About 6 bells, that is 3 o'clock p.m., we saw a sail of our larboard bow. She came down to us, backed her main topsail, and the two vessels stood head on, bowed and curveting at each other like a couple of war horses reined in by their riders. It was the first vessel that I had seen near, and I was surprised to find how much she rolled and pitched in so quiet a sea. She plunged her head into the sea, and then, her stern settling gradually down, her huge bows rose up, showing the bright copper, and her stem and breast hooks dripping. Motorboat. Her decks were filled with passengers who had come up at the cry of "Sail ho!" and who, by their dress and features, appeared to be Swiss and French immigrants. She held us at first in French, but receiving no answer, she tried us in English. There is a settled routine for hailing ships at sea. "Ship ahoy!" Answer, "Hoo-ah!" "What ship is that, pray?" "The ship Carolina, from Havre, bound to New York." "Where are you from?" "The brig Pilgrim, from Boston, bound to the coast of California, 5 days out." Unless there is leisure or something special to say, this form is not much varied from. She then filled away and left us to plow on through our waste of waters.